To open ourselves to tensions, we must move beyond focusing on our mindsets and thinking to be able to engage our heart. We need to use our emotions as an enabling resource rather than a crippling obstacle. A small excerpt from part 3 of both and thinking, embracing creative tensions to solve your toughest problems. It is a pleasure to be joined once again by the co-author of that brilliant book, Wendy Smith. Welcome back.
It's so great to be back here with you.
It's been an absolute pleasure spending this time with you, and thanks for giving me 3 bites at the cherry as well to learn even deeper and follow the 3 parts of the book as well. So the last part is turning towards emotions, and this is a huge part. Most resistance, as you rightly know from studying innovation, comes from fear, and that triggers emotions. And I thought I'd tee you up perhaps for this with a beautiful quote from the book. You said, "The uncertainty created by paradox is inevitable. The detrimental outcomes from that uncertainty are optional. Our underlying paradoxical dilemmas can surface deep fear, anxiety, and defensiveness. All those are real and important emotions to accept. However, it is these emotions that can lead us to narrow our focus and resort to either or thinking. If we ruminate on fear for too long, we end up pushing ourselves farther and farther down the rabbit hole. We need to honor our fear, but then find a different approach to respond to the competing demands. That is, by recognizing our emotional discomfort, we can then use tools to find comfort with the discomfort." I love that. And I thought I'd just throw that at you to open up today's show.
I love that you read that. I want to just offer two thoughts to open up that, to expand this conversation. The first is emotions matter. Emotions matter. We know that in our gut. And yet, every time I sit down with my academic colleagues, when I sit down with leaders in workshops, the first thing is, how do we change mindsets? And so we know that our emotions are important to inform our behaviors, and yet we still somehow have this idea that we are walking brains, that we're brains with a body attached to move it around, and that our emotions, we should just leave them out of the workplace. But that's not the way we operate as human beings. And so emotions matter, and they particularly matter when it comes to navigating tensions, because tensions raise uncertainty. There's open questions about how to navigate them, how to deal with them. They raise anxiety. They raise defensiveness. If I pick one way and there's an opposite way, I start to defend that as if my ego and honor is at stake, and that's emotional. And if we pretend our emotions don't exist, we're going to get ourselves into a bad place. So the question is, how do we deal in a different way?
Let's show our audience how to do that, because one of the things we try to do on the show, Wendy, is explore all elements, the holistic approach to innovation or change, including personal level. So this could be health or fitness or breathing. All these kind of things have a huge impact on how we embrace change or how we step up in times where we need to be resilient. And you introduced 3 tools here, and I'm going to share on the screen once again for those people who are following us on YouTube, 3 of the tools that Wendy shares in the paradox system. And this is particularly to do with comfort with discomfort. So I'd love you to take us through these main tools.
So I just want to highlight the comfort in discomfort. There's something important. The important idea here is that the discomfort exists. The fear, the anxiety, the defensiveness, those are all real. And importantly, these tools are in service of noticing that, recognizing and embracing that, and then dealing with it. And what we mean by, and I want to just say, so what we mean by recognizing and embracing is that if we try and say, look, this fear, this discomfort, I don't want to deal with it. It's not worth it. And we try and metaphorically sweep it under the rug, pretend it doesn't exist. What we know from research is that those emotions will rebound. They will come back even more powerfully. Imagine in a leadership space where something is bothering you, you don't deal with it, or in a personal space, something is bothering you, you don't deal with it, you try and pretend it's not there, you bury it, you tell yourself it shouldn't be a problem. The next thing you know, it doesn't go away. It's not like you can really bury it, but actually psychologically, it just brews inside of you until it bursts out, probably in a way that you don't want it to at all. That's what happens with these competing demands, is that we experience these tensions. We've talked about the tension between navigating between today and tomorrow, or pressures between which shows up as pressures between the innovative business and the existing business, or the pressures between the sustainability folks and the finance folks. And they create these conflicts. And if we don't talk about them, if we don't deal with them, they burst out and create these problems in these relationships, or they burst out in ways that don't allow us to come up with a more creative, productive solution. So the invitation here is to start by pausing. The pause allows us to notice the tension, notice the discomfort that comes from the tension, notice the negative emotions. Taking a breath, literally pausing and taking a breath, and creating some space between the triggering emotion and our response. Some of your listeners might know the famous idea by Viktor Frankl that notes that our power, our agency as individuals happens in that micro moment between some kind of trigger and our response. And then we get to, in that moment, decide how we want to respond to something and what's going to happen, rather than the trigger causing us to decide how to respond in its own way. If we can just expand that micro moment a little bit, we give ourselves that moment of space to really lean into the kind of response or the kind of action that we want to engage with. So noticing that there's tension, noticing that there is a difficult emotion, pausing and taking a deep breath to reframe the response. I used to, in this, and I think I write about this in the book, I used to, in meetings, put a big black X on my hand as I would walk into meetings. So I would walk into meetings. I knew that I would sit in a meeting, people would say something and I would get defensive or I would get reactive and I would just blurt out my thought. So I would put this kind of X on my hand as a reminder to stay quiet, listen, take a deep breath, and pause, so that I can offer a more informed, reflective, curious, engaged reaction rather than a responsive, immediate triggered reaction. And so that's the first piece, the pause, which looks like taking a deep breath, looks like sitting back for a second, looks like being curious for a moment before letting your emotions drive your react. And that's number one.
I love that, Wendy, because it's something that we don't really talk about much, because it might be considered a bit woo-woo, but actually we're learning more and more, as you know, from neuroscience, that it has a dramatic effect on how we even think. And even if I do breathing exercises throughout my day, I can get more out of my brain. My brain recovers quickly. It takes on the information better. I show up better in relationships. I communicate better. There's so much in it that I hope now people will start to bring that in more and more. I'm always encouraged to see, you'll see now top sports teams taking time as a team to come together and breathing together in moments of stress in the game. I think that's such an important thing. I always point it out to my kids and go, see, daddy's not crazy. But it's such an important piece.
I want to say just two quick things. First, the number of senior leaders that I speak to now, CEOs, C-suite, that will talk about the importance of this pause, of taking a breath before they step into a meeting to compose themselves, of pausing in a meeting before they respond. So even as it sounds like it is more new age and sitting on the mat and meditating, it shows up in these micro ways for leaders as a very profound and provocative practice. And breathing is what we do on a daily basis. And so it can feel like we're entering into this new age world, or your listeners can just take it as like what we do, we breathe. And can we just pause and notice that to calm our emotions before we go forward. And indeed, the second piece, the accepting the discomfort, Buddhist thinking has had some profound impact, which has now come up in research as well, to see how we need to value and accept our emotions in order to move past them. And I'll just say this second arrow because I think it's profound if other people have not heard it. The Buddhist notion is that we get hit by a first arrow, it causes pain, but then we create this story about the pain where we feel guilty or angry about being hit or frustrated. And that is all what the Buddhists will call the additional suffering. And that we as human beings experience pain, but we cause onto ourselves the additional suffering. That's what they note as the second arrow, the additional emotional intensity that goes along with or that we create around that pain. So what does it look like to notice that there are difficult things and there are difficult moments and we experience these challenges and that's all real, but not to add on the additional suffering. And in fact, to your point, I am a big fan of the work of psychologist and Buddhist Tara Brach, who has a great book called Radical Acceptance. And she indeed makes this case about how the practices of starting with accepting all of what we feel as a starting point to enable us to broaden, to enable us to respond differently. And for her, the practice of acceptance is just starting to say, yes, I feel defensive. Might not be what I want to feel, but I feel defensive. Yes, I wish that they just said yes to my idea without coming up with an alternative plan because that would feel more respectful. Yes, I'm feeling jealous. Yes, I'm feeling angry. Yes, I'm feeling a lot of anxiety and fear about the uncertainty of how the world is playing out right now. Yes. And just honoring that. It's like a jujitsu move. If we say no, stop feeling those things, all of those things will come back and push back against us. But if we say, yes, those things are okay, then all of those emotions can stop defending themselves in us, and we can move forward more effectively.
I love that. I try to teach my kids the idea that words are the language of the mind and emotions or feelings are the language of the
Yes.
heart. And they don't speak the same language. So they don't communicate very well to each other. So you have to actually lean in and understand what's the emotion trying to convey to you. And firstly, like what you started off with, it takes the moment of pause because you have to be in quietude in order to be able to let that in and understand what it's trying to say to you.
Yeah, I think about this as a parenting or partnering or just being in relationship as well, that we know that when we bring something to a friend that's difficult, and the first reaction, because our friends don't want to hear the difficulty, and so they start telling us why we shouldn't feel that way or how they're going to find the silver lining or all of the reasons. All you want to do then is say, no, I just feel crappy or I just feel frustrated or I just feel whatever it might be. But the kind of friendship or listening we want in the moment is just an empathetic acknowledgement. Yeah, like where we are. And so offering that to someone else in listening is really quite important. Somebody's going through something difficult. Our kids, our partners, our friends, our colleagues, they don't want us to just dismiss the difficulty and find the silver lining and get back to some kind of idealized form. They want to just acknowledge or be okay with being in that difficulty. And it's the same thing that we can do to ourselves. Rather than dismiss or try and reject the difficult emotions, the discomfort, the fears, all these challenges, how do we just acknowledge that's okay? Because that's what's going to give us power to move forward in a more productive way. It's this ironic effect, if you will.
It's such an important point for relationships or for organizational change. I think one of the key things I learned in my own relationship is I was always trying to fix things or come up with a solution instead of just acknowledging, look, that situation absolutely sucks. And you see this all the time, as do I, when I read about innovation, that at the end, when an organization realizes it has to let go, which ultimately means letting go of some of their colleagues, perhaps that they built version 1 of a business or version 2 with, they need to leave the organization because they no longer fit where it's going. That's just a really terrible situation that has to be acknowledged, and there's no point in trying to just kick the can down the road. And this is where the next one comes in, the idea of broadening our perspectives, because that helps us reach for positive emotions.
Yes. Yes. And I'm so thrilled to talk about this. And in fact, I might have said this in previous parts. We are working on the next book, and this broadening our perspective is the heart of what we want to explode out, because essentially it's given the problems that we face in the world, we need to bring together multiple different approaches to come up with creative solutions. And we need to be in conversation with people sometimes that have a very different and potentially onerous perspective that are hard for us to sit with. But that's what's going to lead us to the ways in which we're going to solve our world's greatest problems. And because we feel fear, what we do in the moments where we are dealing with these big complex issues is we narrow ourselves. And narrowing looks like we reinforce the ways we always think about things. We surround ourselves with other people that are similar to us. We think about other people as them, and we alienate the them rather than being in conversation, rather than being curious, rather than being engaged. And what it does is that it leads us individually to be less creative, to be in the short term in service of trying to minimize the discomfort we feel by minimizing the uncertainty and anxiety and reinforcing what we already know. In the long term, it leads to more narrowness, which leads us to be more limited, which leads to more detrimental emotional impacts. And it also leads us out of connection and collaboration with other people. So the question that we are exploring is, why do we do that? It's such a natural thing for people to do and counterproductive. And what does it take to invite people into opening the aperture, starting with being curious, to hear things that are different, to open up the way we think about things and expand our thinking, which in the short term might be difficult to do, but in the long term allows us to be in relationship in ways, and be in the world in ways, and be creative in ways that we never thought were possible. That's the invitation.
Beautiful. And one of the things that we touched on, and probably not as much, and I thought we'd lean into this a little bit for the rest of the episode, is I'm going to skip past there's a chapter on should I stay or should I go now? Ultimately, a point everybody meets where they're like, should I stay in this organization or leave? So Wendy and Marianne help you navigate that. It's brilliantly done. There's tools about how to navigate that. Then there's interpersonal conflict, which kind of overlaps with organizational change, which is where I'd love to focus the rest of the show. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was dynamism. Even the word dynamism is such a powerful word. But you talked about this particularly with the changes that were needed in W.L. Gore and Son. We touched on this before, but I want to remind our audience that this was the original team of teams organization. These parts of the team, totally decentralized, could make decisions, could be entrepreneurial. And then along comes a new leader, brings the whole organization together. It needs to introduce different ways of being, because now customers were overlapping. It was a very different organization. And that was met with massive, massive resistance. And therefore you need dynamism. And I loved what you wrote here. You said, to avoid falling into rabbit holes in the first place, or to help us emerge quickly, we need tools that enable dynamism. Dynamism involves actions that spur learning, enable adaptation, and encourage ongoing shifts before competing demands. Not only can such dynamic actions prevent us from getting stuck in ruts, but they can help us take advantage of creative tensions. By constantly reconsidering the nature of alternative sides, we can unleash the creativity in paradoxes, finding new mules, or more effectively walking our tightropes. I love that paragraph because it brings together so many of the elements from the book.
Yeah. So I just want to frame this that, again, we started in the first show talking about this paradox system. The system is these 4 sets of tools that bring together the research that our colleagues have been doing over the last 25 years into these buckets, these sets of tools. And dynamism is the fourth bucket. The important part, there's two important parts to the system. One, that it's a system, which means it's not about choosing one or the other. It's about how they reinforce each other. And the second piece that is that is baked into this system, and it's a paradox system, but it's also paradoxical, because we argue that managing paradox is paradoxical, which means that these sets of tools themselves balance opposing pressures with one another. And this tool of dynamism is about being agile and change and enabling shifting and movement. And it is balanced against, it happens alongside the tool, which we call boundaries, which is about creating the static structures to scaffold both anding. So you've got, on one hand, these static structures to scaffold both anding, the way you set up the rules and the roles and the people and the vision, and that are all hold in place boundaries to invite both and. And then you create these practices, these dynamic practices that allow you to see new possibilities, experiment, try new things, not get stuck. And the more that you create the effective boundaries, the more that you can engage in these experimental practices. Things like being open to serendipity. What do we mean by that? That things come along that you don't even know and expect. And oftentimes we just shut them out because we're not looking we're not open to new possibility, to luck. What we know from research is that actually luck happens all around us. It's not that there's lucky people and unlucky people. It's there's people that are able to see and be open to lucky possibilities. And there's those that are closed and too narrow and focused and can't experience them. And so these boundaries create the conditions that enable us to be more dynamic, but these practices invite us into being more dynamic, more experimental, serendipitous, or seeing serendipity along the way.
As you know, we did an extensive series on Clayton Christensen's work, and you knew Clay, and he talked about Honda. And you mentioned as well here, Honda is a great example of this, where you're open to experimentation, but then you're open to serendipity. You don't have a very tight strategy that you get behind. You're more emergent with that strategy. I'd love you to share this. This is just such a great story. We've shared it before in the show, but I just think it's one of the best examples of both serendipity and just being open to an emergent mindset.
Yeah, it's a great example of that. And it's a great example about how we want to rationalize everything. So one of the things I love about what they call the Honda effect is the basic story is Honda comes into the US market with motorcycles, ultimately introduces the sort of smaller and more lightweight motorcycle that is not just for long-term drives across the country, but enables you to scoot around in cities, and becomes a smashing success. And so the question is why? And the interesting part is that Boston Consulting Group came in and did a report on why and how. And this report, which was taught to business school students all over the place, essentially made the case for a very rational, strategic, planned approach of how Honda came in with a clear strategy and knew and understand that this was an open market opportunity for lightweight motorcycles, came in and introduced that. And wow, look at what it's like to develop strategy. And several people said, I'm not sure that's exactly what happened. Like, thank you, BCG, for this post hoc rationalization, or what our colleague Carl Weick calls retrospective sense making. But that's not what actually happened. And got back together some of the initial executives of Honda and said, well, what actually did happen? Well, 3 of us were sent over to the United States, and we didn't really speak English that well, and we had very few funds, and we're all shacked up in one apartment together. And we brought this heavyweight Honda motorcycle, but it turned out that it wasn't as good for the distances that people were driving in the United States, and the motor would burn out, and we had to send it back. Well, while we were sending it back, we're scooting around trying to figure out what to do in the meantime here in LA. And in doing that, some folks from Sears were like, wow, gosh, we could think about selling this not in competition to cars, but maybe in competition to bicycles. And what would it look like to not have this sold by the big motorcycle and automobile dealers, but have it sold at Sears? And so what would that look like and what's possible? And they start, and so it was a series of urgent moments in which this lightweight motorcycle became a huge success in the United States. And so this has been written into business school lore as the planned strategy school and the emergent strategy school, and the distinction between them in terms of strategy, whether it and by the way, and so there's huge. I'll say two things. One, there's huge value in noticing emergence. It doesn't make the leaders look like they are the brilliant strategists who set out with a clear plan and then accomplished it. So let's notice the emergence. And by the way, what we know is that leadership requires both foresight, planning, thinking through to create the conditions to allow for experimentation and emergence. It should not, that too is not an either or. That too is a both.
Speaking of both and, the brilliant case study is saved for the end, where Paul Polman, and many of our audience don't remember this, but when Paul Polman was made CEO of Unilever, it was equivalent to when Satya Nadella came in as CEO of Microsoft. People thought it was a poison chalice. It was 2009. The company had gone through lots of cost cutting, people being let go from the organization, poor M&A strategy, poorly executed. It was post Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And he came to a company that had no morale. They were even, as you say, using competitors' soaps in their toilets when they produced soap themselves. So this was the position that Paul Polman walked into Unilever. But I didn't know until the way you framed it in the book is that he totally leaned into paradoxes, and he totally leaned into both and thinking, and you interviewed him for the book. And it's just a brilliant case study to bring everything we've learned so far together. I'd love you to share your highlights of this case study.
Yeah, and for your readers, I am a huge fan of the book that he wrote with Andrew Winston, Net Positive, where he captures the case study in so much more depth. And I do love, they talk about him entering into the death spiral of what had become of Unilever. I love the moment where they don't even use their own products in their corporate headquarters, their tea in their cafeteria, their soaps in their bathroom. It was just a real death spiral. And when we spoke to Paul, and we spoke to him a couple of times as we developed the book, one thing that he said to us very clearly was, there will be tensions. My job as a leader is to surface those tensions and use them to enable more creative thinking rather than to bury them. And how can I create the conditions to do that in a safe way that sees this as a positive and valuable exercise rather than something that's detrimental? And for him, one of the things that he did and that he is known for in those 10 or 11 years that he was at Unilever was to institute or to implement the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And the Unilever Sustainable, as some people will know, or some people might not, essentially what he did was he made a very strong commitment that Unilever, which is a packaged goods company and has products like soap and hygiene products, shampoos, etc., lots of food products. They bought over Ben and Jerry's. They sell other kinds of ice cream and iced tea and all kinds. His commitment in the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan was that they were going to create each of those brands with a commitment to a set of very clear social objectives that were going to change the way people experience the world. People at the bottom of the pyramid, the most financially challenged part of our world, most disadvantaged, people across the spectrum, that change the way people experience the world, have a set of environmental objectives that were going to impact the trajectory of our earth and climate and environment, and that they were going to make a commitment to those, not adjacent to, alongside their financial commitment, and not despite their financial commitment, but in service of, they were going to enable them to double their profits through these commitments to these things. Now, there's lots of companies now trying to figure out how they can courageously address the tensions between social environmental demands alongside financial ones. They get it. It's important to do, but it's really hard because they come up in conflict with one another all the time. So for Unilever, it would be things like, well, in the short term, it is cost cutting to not deal with the externalities of pollution in my plants, but that has an environmental impact. Or in the short term, financially, we will make more money if we sell our shampoos in smaller packaging, but that packaging, adding more packaging, has an environmental outcome to it. So there's all these tensions that arise in trying to address these competing demands. And his point is those tensions that can feel difficult and that can feel like this ongoing pressures, again, between the marketing people and the R&D people or the finance people, and like you can just feel those tug of wars. How can we create a culture in our organization where we value those tensions, we bring them to the surface, and we use that as an opportunity for learning, growth, and moving forward, rather than something that we're going to bury or something that's going to create challenge? That was the question, and that's the way he culturally led the company, and culturally and strategically led the company.
The core element of all this is you talked earlier on about guardrails, and that when you introduce, say, what he did, new ways of doing things, new practices, etc., people tend to focus in on the upside for them and the downside, creating this kind of either or mindset. And he talked about, and you talk about in the book, about the importance of getting above that to find this higher purpose, that people focus on that, and then that unveils all these paradoxes below it. I thought that would be an important thing to share for those leaders listening to the show who are struggling with this themselves, because you can do this. You don't have to be the CEO of an organization or an SLT member. You can do this with your own department of a team, or you can do this for yourself, having a higher purpose to drag yourself through those difficult times and help you navigate paradoxes.
Yeah, absolutely. I see this. I lead a women's leadership center who's in a big university. We're a small group. We're constantly navigate or trying to lean into a set of practices within our own group in order to navigate these ongoing tensions. And again, in the big picture, for those people that are abstract, this is creating the scaffolding, creating the structures, creating the boundaries that enable this kind of dynamic living into these competing demands. So very specifically at Unilever, if the team was going to be constantly surfacing tensions between their environmental goals and their financial goals, or whatever it might be, between more packaging or less packaging, manufacturing that address pollution, they have to know why they're doing it, and they have to be in constant conversation to address these tensions. And as you're pointing out, part of the why is this higher purpose, this overarching integrative vision statement. So again, for Paul Polman, what he said to us when we spoke to him is the very first thing that he did in taking over Unilever was to understand what's the point, what's the mission, what's the vision, what's the overarching vision. And for them, he leaned back into their historical roots, which was making everyday life easier and making it more complex, to making sustainable living easier on an everyday level. It's essentially the essence of what they were trying to accomplish. What we want to do is create a world where sustainable living is easier for people every day. It enables two things. One, it's motivational. Like, why are we here? Why are we doing this work on a daily basis? Why are we dealing with these tensions? So it answers the why question. That's first of all, the motivational why question. But the second is that it reminds us how to accomplish that overarching goal. We need to accommodate these competing demands, these opposing demands. What it essentially does, we like the metaphor. It gives us sort of the vision out into the future that allows us to stand in the chaos of the moment. And the metaphor that we use for that is you're standing on a rocky boat, you're feeling the sort of rockiness back and forth in that moment. And the way that you're told to stabilize yourself is to look out to the horizon. Because by looking out to that broader perspective, you can deal with the discomfort of the instability in that moment. The overarching vision invites you to look out to the broader perspective and say, well, why am I dealing with this kind of chaotic back and forth tug of war in the moment to like get to that? It's both to motivate and to stabilize that moment for you. So one of the things that leaders can do at any level is to continually name, articulate that higher purpose and remind people that that's valuable and important. I want to just say one more thing, because in order to get there, the second practice that we talk about is the importance of separating and connecting. And what we mean by that is then not papering over the tensions, but naming them and then giving each side, separating, valuing, honoring, recognizing, creating time and space to listen and value to the different perspectives in service of finding the points of integration. I think sometimes that's overlooked. And what that looks like in practice is, as a leader, I'm going to, at my meeting, say, look, we've got these two different ways of thinking about it. Let's create some time to really explore both so that we can hear it both. Or as a leader, knowing that there's tensions between your finance person and your sustainability person, or the person dealing with the short term and the long term. Let me go spend time with both of those people to hear what they have to say so that we can find those points of connection. And that too was something that Paul Polman was really good at, which was creating the space to honor. It's not, I'm just going to talk about social and environmental and forget that we have a financial bottom line. And I'm not going to just talk about the financial and forget the social and environmental. I'm going to create space for both of them.
And as a scholar of innovation, you understand that that's constantly comes up with innovation, the old and the new, and it seems like a battle between the old and the new instead of actually working together, because they both ultimately want the same things. They might be rewarded differently or measured differently, which is a huge part. And I highly recommend reading the book. And don't forget, I have a copy of the book up for grabs for those people who sign up to the Substack of the Innovation Show as well. You can win a brilliant copy of that book. Because in there, Wendy also talks about the importance of just being able to have those conversations and even train your team, and putting aside, like Paul Polman and his company did, training budget for people to be able to retrain. And then they decide, should I leave? I don't think I belong in this organization. I don't agree where it's going, etc. There is loads and loads in there. But you highlighted a very important thing. And throughout the book and throughout the series, we've talked about the 4 types of paradoxes that show up constantly throughout different aspects of our lives: performing, learning, belonging, and organizing. But in this last part, you talk then about, well, from a leadership perspective, they mirror what the challenges are for leadership in times of VUCA or times of rapid change. And these are challenges of obligation, innovation, globalization, and coordination. I'd love you to, at a high level, share what they are about and how they reflect the 4 types of paradoxes.
Yeah. So essentially the 4 that you just mentioned, what they do is they mirror, we think of the performing, learning, organizing, belonging as the more generic articulation of these tensions that we experience, whether it's in our organizations, in our interpersonal relationships, or in our interpersonal lives. By defining them in the end of the book as organization, globalization, obligation, and innovation, we look at those tensions and we say, well, what does that look like in strategy for organizations, for governments, for small teams? Like, what does that look like in the context of our teams, right? Or in the context of our organizing and our leadership? And so for example, the innovation tension is what we call a tension of learning. It's a tension of time. It's a tension between today and tomorrow, between what we do now and what we have to do in the future. And that's about how we learn, grow, change, and shift along the way. The obligation tension is our label for a sustainability tension, the tension between what we need to do for the social versus the financial, social and environmental versus the financial, the mission versus the markets, the profit versus the planet, and how we can accommodate both of those. And we call that's a form of performing tensions, because it's the tension of, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the outcome? Where are we trying to go? So essentially and what we say, and this is a piece of work that we published in Harvard Business Review before the book with our colleague Mike Tushman, who I know you've had on the show, and about noting how these tensions, these four tensions show up across organizations. They might be more salient. One might be more salient in one organization than another. It might be that the tensions are more poignant, but they show up in all organizations. And by the way, and this is where it becomes really valuable. The important piece here, I think I said this earlier, is not you can name your exact tension, but that you see just how often tensions show up in so many different aspects of the organization. You can notice that along the way, and then notice that they reinforce each other. So even in Paul Polman's case, where perhaps the most salient tension, because of his most salient strategic tension, is this obligation or social, environmental, and financial, or mission market tension, because of the Unilever strategic, his Unilever sustainable living plan. And still, that triggers tensions of innovation, because then they have to figure out how they're going to innovate. For example, if they're going to accommodate people who live on $1 a day, well, they can't buy the same products that we're buying in the developed world where we have more disposable income. So they have to innovate. So that creates tensions between today and tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, in order to accommodate these different types of products for the developing world versus the developed world, they have to think about what it means to be more strategic about local needs and can't just create global products that they're going to export everywhere. So there's this tension between what's their global integrated perspective versus some distinct local needs. So there's this globalization tension that it triggers. So essentially, it reinforces how it's important to start and notice which tensions we are experiencing, and then notice how they actually are knotted, which is the language paradox theorists use. They're knotted with each other. It's not just one tension, but they trigger one another.
And one of the things you talked about there from an example was performing paradoxes. So even metrics and how shareholders would view this, because some shareholders actually pulled out their shares and got out of the business. They didn't agree with it so drastically. And there was just so much in that, and we won't have time to cover it. I highly recommend read that book. Also read Paul Polman's book as well. So you mentioned, maybe the last thing we'll share are 3 things that you can do. So the first is build guardrails around paradoxical poles. I love that language. The second is to diversify the stakeholders. And this is not tick the box diversity. This is diversity at every level of the organization. And then the last thing is something that we know well on the show, is to encourage experimentation. But I love these, again, through the lenses of your work and both and thinking.
Yeah, well, I will also recommend, so in this question of broadening your stakeholders, some of your listeners might know stakeholder theory, Ed Freeman. He just came out with a book with his co-authors, and I think it's called The Power of And. There is and in the title. It reinforces the idea that if we are going to create more robust organizations, we need to think about a more robust set of stakeholders, not just our shareholders. Those can create conflicts, the same kind of conflicts and tensions that we're talking about here, the same kind of conflicts and tensions that Unilever experiences, because your stakeholder, your employees might have needs that come in conflict with your customers. So how do you bring those together? Or your employees and customers might have needs to be more expansive that are cost demanding, that come in conflict with your shareholders, which want you to minimize costs. So shareholder theory and the book that they just came out with reinforces that you've got to live in the and to do that. And one way to do that is to make sure that the voices that you are listening to around the table that are informing your decision making value or represent these different perspectives. So that's the diversity. And here, Paul Polman had to essentially shift some of the people that were on their board, because those people had to what they had to share was a collective commitment to being in the and they each had to bring perspectives that were going to offer different perspectives. I'll say it the other way. They each had to offer different perspectives of different groups that they were going to represent at the table, but they couldn't just come and represent those different perspectives and be ready to fight for it. That's what we typically do. Like, I'm coming in and I'm representing whatever it might be, and I'm going to fight for that group at the table. No, they had to wear two hats. They had to wear the hat of, I'm going to represent the global South, and I have a perspective and I understand what it means to engage with development work. But I'm also going to come in and I'm going to put on the other hat, which is that in order for me to be able to succeed in representing the global South, I also have to see this as a going concern that's going to succeed over time. I'm going to have to be able to see this all come together collectively. And I'll just tell you, I'm working on a research project with a fabulous team, a colleague in Australia and a colleague that just finished her PhD at Barcelona. And we're looking at this question of how negotiators manage to come to collective agreements, particularly in the context of COP, where you've got all these different countries that are there negotiating with one another. And it becomes clear at some point in time that everybody's coming in to fight for their country's need. But at some point, they've got to then realize that they work together. Otherwise, they all fail. So how do they put on these two different hats? And that's what these group of stakeholders have to do.
A final element, and I just thought this would be a really nice way to finish the show and the series in particular, is something that is a red thread through all kinds of change and something that we need to lead into. We talked earlier on about breathing in this part 3, but the idea of honoring discomfort and leaning into it and realizing that leaders don't have to have all the answers is such an important thing. Also on an individual level, and one of the paradoxes you mentioned is to be forthright but humble. And I loved what you said here. You said for a long time, business leaders assumed that people could check their emotions at the door of work and focus only on cognitive rationality. We now know differently. Rather than assume that people can deny or repress their emotions, great leaders create environments that can recognize and help inform these reactions, welcoming people's vulnerability. I absolutely love that, and I chose that as one of my favorite quotes to finish this series. I'd love you to riff on that as a final share for our audience.
I'm so grateful to wrap up with that, because when I do talks, I often see people, I'm grateful to see people shake their heads, like intellectually they get it. There's something really valuable in the both and. But when it comes to like sitting at your desk and living into these tug of wars and into these conflicts and noticing how uncomfortable it is, and noticing that you've got to honor somebody who you really disagree with, it gets messy and hard. And so I just want to acknowledge with empathy that this is valuable. I really hope that people will see the value, but it's not easy. And we're constantly reminding ourselves to acknowledge that it's not easy and keep working at it.
Beautiful. And last question is, where can people find you? Because you encourage people to take advantage of the paradox mindset inventory. This is all at the end of the book as well, but you have resources online as well. And also for people who want to reach out to you, bring you over to this part of the world as well. I encourage that for people who are listening from Europe and Ireland, and learn more about your work, your keynotes, etc. Where's the best place to find you?
Yes, the easiest place to find us is to follow us on our website. It's bothandthinking.net. I am super active also on LinkedIn. We can find that through our website. We also have a Substack, and I'm going to go sign up for yours, although you shouldn't send me a copy of the book. I hope other people do as well. But we also have a newsletter now. It's not an either or. If people want to continue on this journey with us, we are so welcome to have fellow travelers living into the difficulties or living into the potential of both and.
It was an absolute pleasure joining you, and I'm so grateful for your time. This is the book. I have a copy up for grabs, and don't forget, I will share it on the Substack and also restack your Substack as well. author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. Wendy Smith, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.